So now we've learned 3 different ways to solve systems. So our first option is graphing. And then we learned substitution. And lastly, we learned elimination. For option 1 and 3, we learned how to use our graphing calculators. And today, we're going to learn how to figure out, if you're given some system, which method you should use without someone telling you. So here's the flow chart you'll kind of follow. So the first question you're going to ask yourself is, are both equations solved for y? So for example, what that means is, do your equations both say like y equals 2x plus 7 and y equals 3x minus 11? If yes, you're going to solve by graphing, and you're going to use your graphing calculator. If your answer to that first question is no, it might say, is one variable isolated? So that could look something like this. Maybe your first equation is 2x plus 3y equals 5, and your second equation is x equals 2x minus 7. Right here, we have x equals some stuff, so is one variable isolated? Yes, we would use substitution. If the answer is no, our equations are most likely going to look something like this. Maybe we have 2x plus 3y equals 5, and then we have negative x minus y equals 16. Then we would use elimination, and we learned elimination now using the graphing calculator. So now when I look at the first example, the first question on our flowchart is, are both equations solved for y? And I have one equation solved for y, but not both, so I would answer no to that first question. The second question on my flowchart is one variable isolated? And yes, it is, because the second equation says y equals x minus 1, and so we would solve this using substitution. And today we're just going to focus on how would we solve it, and we're not actually going to solve it. On this second example, again, I'm going to ask myself, are both equations solved for y? And the answer to that is no. Then I'm going to ask myself, is one variable isolated? Again, the answer is no. And so that would tell me to use elimination. And remember, you can do that using your graphing calculator. For the next example, the first thing I ask is, are both equations solved for y? And if you look, I have y equals for both equations, so I would say yes. And that means I'm going to solve using graphing, and I can do that on my graphing calculator. Take a second to look at this next example, use your flowchart, and then determine which method you should use. So on this one, the first question you ask is, are both equations solved for y? Hopefully you thought to yourself yes, and that meant you would use graphing. Try this next example, so use your flowchart, try to figure out which method you should use. If you look at your flowchart, the first question is, are both equations solved for y? And no, neither of them are. The second question is one variable isolated? And so if you look right here, I have x equals 4y plus 1. So yes, one variable is isolated, so you would solve using substitution. Now try this last example. So take a few seconds. Use your flowchart and figure out what method you should use for this. Hopefully you said no, both equations are not solved for y. And hopefully you said no, one variable is not isolated. And so that would mean we're going to use elimination.